Well, good evening. Welcome to Writing for Peace Sunday Live Lit Reading. And I'm Brad Wetzler's my name. I'm really excited to be here tonight. And we have a very special guest in David Ulin. And I'll start with a short bio from David about David. David L. Ulin is the author or editor of many books, including Sidewalking, Coming to Terms with Los Angeles, shortlisted for the PEN Diamonstein-Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay, The Lost Art of Reading, Books and Resistance in a Troubled Time, and Writing Los Angeles, a literary anthology, which won a California Book Award. He is recipient of a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, a Tom and Mary Gallagher Fellowship from Black Mountain Institute at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a Lannan Foundation Residency Fellowship. The former book editor and book critic of the Los Angeles Times, he has written for Agni, the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times, the Paris Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, and National Public Radio's All Things Considered. He teaches at the University of Southern California, and most recently has edited Joan Didion, the 1960s and 70s, the first volume of an omnibus edition of the author's works published by the Library of America. Really happy to have you here, David. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm happy to spend the Sunday evening with all of you.
Good. Well, I like to begin with a question about a piece of writing that moved you, that changed you when you were younger. Can you fill us in on something that really kind of changed your life, that changed everything, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, apropos of what you were just mentioning in the bio of the Didion work, the real answer is when I first read Joan Didion's essays in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, when I was about 18 years old, and particularly the title essay, which is the essay about Haight-Ashbury during the Summer of Love, it completely changed the way I thought about writing. I mean, I'd never seen writing like that before. I never read writing like that before, but it was the first inkling I had of that nonfiction could be literature, that essay writing could be literature. I had not, I had always sort of imagined, I'd wanted to be a writer from a young age, but I'd always thought of myself through the lens of first of poetry and then fiction writing. And I'd thought about nonfiction more in terms of like school papers or journalism or things like that. But reading Didion and reading kind of the way that she used language and used fiction writers' techniques in terms of characterization and scene work, and also the way that she was able to weave in her own kind of contemporary experience that make the work could be immediate. It could be art, but it could be responsive to the world that the writer was moving through. That was a kind of game-changing realization for me, and it absolutely changed the way I thought about being a writer, what the position of a writer was, the kind of political or social significance of writing, and all of it. And so I think that essay in particular, but that whole collection in general.
What about that essay thematically struck you? I mean, at that time, you were 18 years old. What year was this that it came out?
I read it in 1980, and I was living on Haight Street at the time, and kind of navigating the sort of backwater of the 60s that was still there. I mean, in spring of 1980, to this day there still is, but in the spring of 1980, Haight Street, there were a lot of 60s holdovers, a lot of 60s casualties. There were a lot of squatters, a lot of deadheads, a lot of all of that moving through this territory, or I was moving through that territory with them. And so Didion's take on the Summer of Love, which I had always romanticized, her take is the opposite of romanticized, really kind of resonated with me a little bit, because I was dealing with some of the people 13 years later on the streets who she, not the exact people, but some of who she had been kind of writing about. And so it opened up my sense both of the possibility of counterculture, but also of the potential, the dangers of a lack of collective narrative, let's say, which is something that I've been kind of obsessed with ever since.
Great. Well, I'd like to start out with you reading something. What do you have to read tonight?
Well, I have a few things. I thought, as I said, I thought I would start with an essay. It's a shortish essay. It's about 10, 11 minutes, and that'll be the longest piece I have to read, and that'll just kind of set the table. It's an essay. For the last several years, I've been working on a kind of sequence of essays that I wrote the year I was 53. The year I was 53, I wrote an essay a week for 53 weeks, starting the week before my birthday and then throughout. Just to kind of, I'm really fascinated with sort of, I don't want to call them slice of life essays, but pieces of art that kind of grow out of daily experience. And I wanted to do that. It's been, I'm no longer 53. It's been a while trying to figure out how to make this into a coherent book, although I've published a number of the essays, and this is one of them. Most of the essays, well, I have a kind of preference for utilitarian titles. So most of the essays have kind of utilitarian one-word titles. So this is an essay called Bed. And all the essays are dated for the week that they took place or were written. So the date on this is December 4th, 2014. The night before I go to the desert, I sleep in our old bed for the last time. Ray is here beside me, although as usual or often she is turned head to foot. Molly Bloom, yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. This is a strategy she developed years ago, reaction to my snoring, when she doesn't abandon the bed altogether, sleeping on a mattress in Noah's room to evade the noise. That is where this bed will go. Noah's room, once the new one is delivered, the remaking of our house in increments, time pursuing its slow passage, its incursions, conditional yet also lasting, small ripples begetting big movements, change upon change. But I digress. No, the bed, the old one. We have had it for more than 20 years. Our first substantial purchase in California, and if I can't remember when exactly we switched over from our futon, I do remember it as the heart, or at least the ventricle of everything. Both our children were conceived in this bed, and both were nursed here. Both climbed into it when they were sick or couldn't sleep. In February, on the afternoon, we realized Noah's eating disorder was going to require more help than we alone could offer. He wept, more like thrashed, and wailed and rent his garments here on this mattress in his mother's arms. I holed up in this bed, wrote books and essays, read hundreds of novels, hid from the pressing insistence of the world. There is an alternative to war, John Lennon once declared. It's staying in bed and growing your hair. He's not talking about disengaging, and neither am I. For me, this bed, is the place where the purest, most engaged life has taken place, where we reveal ourselves, our vulnerabilities and deepest trustings, where we show each other who we are. I think of John and Yoko in their pajamas, those hotel rooms in Montreal and Amsterdam, singing songs and painting slogans, and what this tells us about how we mean to be. Private and yet also public. Or perhaps the point is that in our public lives, our private selves are revealed. It is in this bed, after all, our bed, that I have most exposed myself, that I have been both sick and happy, secure, protected, and yet in the same moment, utterly, existentially alone. In a real dark night of the soul, Fitzgerald writes, it is always 3 o'clock in the morning, day after day. 3 o'clock in the morning. Fitzgerald's issues were not the same as mine, but this is something we share. I am often awake at this hour, wrested from sleep by my bladder or my conscience, insistence of an anxiety so deep and pervasive it never quiets even in my dreams. I have trouble falling asleep, have for as long as I can remember, find it not only difficult but also treacherous to navigate that boundary between waking and not waking, between being here and not. Sleep is like a shore, or no, not a shore, more like the water that laps upon the shore, an ocean in which I must submerge. At times it feels like drowning, a backwards tumbling, my head, my face going under, unable to breathe. We've all known this, the startle awake, the sensation of having caught yourself in the midst of falling, disquieting certainty that there is no air in your lungs. I gasp, I swallow, I twist and flail, uncertain for the moment whether I am coming back or falling, now and forever, into something deeper, the slipstream that will carry me to the farther shore. This is a cliche, I know it, framing sleep in terms of death, le petit mort, which is, of course, a different sort of trope. And yet there is something, I think, a sense of surrender or loosening that terrifies me about both. Terrifies? It's a strong word to describe my relationship with sleeping. Not entirely accurate, but more so perhaps than I might want to let on. Some nights it captures precisely the way sleeplessness metastasizes, as a rising pressure heightened by the ticking of the clock. My insomnia, if we can call it that, I always get to sleep eventually, always feel the water fold over me like a pair of hands, is at its worst when I have a commitment the next morning, some reason I have to be up and out of the house. It's not as if I sleep in most other days. Usually I'm awake by 6:30 and writing, trying to take advantage of the quiet hours. But the knowledge that I could, were I to need to do so, is like a get out of jail free card. Those other nights, I go through a series of rites and rituals to allay my anxieties. I avoid caffeine, make sure to have a drink, sometimes smoke a little weed. I try to avoid screens, the stimulation of their light, their electricity, their promise that there is something out there that requires my attention, some connection that I need to make. Sleep is about severing connection from yourself, from the world. Once, a decade and a half ago, I wrote a long piece about dream research, tracing the dynamics of the mind at rest. This was before I began to dread or worry about my own sleep, back when I could still routinely slumber the whole night through. This was, in other words, before I created or exacerbated the problem by naming it, by giving it a shape and presence in my psyche. Dreams are either meaningless or they aren't, random expressions of neurons firing or the manifestations of a deeper set of longings and desire. The same might be said about the waking world. I suppose this could be reassuring, the notion that the line between waking and sleeping is indistinct, blurry, but for me, it only makes the apprehension worse. At times, I can hardly tell the difference, slipping into sleep so shallow, I never quite lose sight of myself as a body tossing in a bed. It's worse, of course, when I am not in my own bed, when I'm in a hotel, excuse me, or a guest room where I can't allow myself the consolations of what let's frame as safety, or at least the comfort of familiar space. I never sleep well the first or last night in a new location, the one a matter of acclimatization, the other of its inverse. I turn off the lights, arrange the pillows, one between my knees, one in my arms, one underneath my head, kick out the covers so they are not tucked in. I push my feet through, leave them uncovered, an emblem of freedom or escape. I am in bed right now, feet crossed in the open air, blanket clustered around my waist. I am tired, but it doesn't matter. Were I to roll over, get comfortable, shut my eyes, and wait for drift, I would be wide awake in a moment's time. Awake as in alert, mind moving, tracing, scanning, seeking an idea on which to settle, a worry to work over like the rough edge of a stone. Awake as in aware of the minutes as they pass, slow collapse of distance until morning, the darkness of the night looming like a blank space, an expanse I cannot get across. Partly, I suppose this has to do with getting older. We sleep less as we age. Still, it is not sleep that concerns me, so much as the moment consciousness lets go. Let's go? No, not this either. For sleeping, dreaming is a form of consciousness. In that sense, it is utterly unlike death, which I cannot imagine because there is nothing there, I think, fear to imagine, not a space to traverse, but rather an endless emptiness. On the one hand, it is about control, this back and forth of sleeping, not unlike my unwillingness to be put under by anesthesia. Control, control, control. This is the great deception. And how to give it up? How do we fall asleep? What is the mechanism? I lay in bed and wonder, even as I know that this will keep me from my rest. The paradox, the more I worry about sleeping, the more it eludes me, the more I toss and turn and slip into anxiety as midnight yields to 1 a.m. I remember my father, when I was a teenager and would come home late or wander into the kitchen at 3 or 4 in the morning, sitting in a wing chair by the window in the study, reading by a kind of hooded half-light, wide awake in his underwear. Sometimes you just have to give in, he told me one night when I asked what he was doing out of bed. He was right, of course, although this giving in, it cuts both ways. Sometimes you have to give in to not sleeping, sometimes to allowing sleep to come. I want to say that it's a matter of comfort, shelter, and it is true that I almost always sleep better at home. In bed with Ray, even head to toe, steady whisper of her respiration, warmth of her back, her breath, yeasty smell of her at rest. I feel protected even from my dreaming. No, she will save me for the moment anyway from myself. In a hotel or someone else's house, I am alone. But even more than that, I am unguarded, left to reveal myself in ways I don't intend. Sleep is among the most intimate of gestures. It is where we let down our guard. No wonder then that I feel most secure in my own bed, girded by the solace of familiars, on the mattress where in all the ways that matter most, the essence of my adult life has been imagined into being. And yet that bed is gone now, moved into Noah's room. He has moved into his own apartment while I've been away. When I return, it will be to a new mattress, new box spring, higher off the ground, Ray says, and firmer, a new adjustment, familiar and unfamiliar at once. I don't mean to make too much of physical things, since they, I know, desert us. What else, however, is the physical, if not a manifestation of our memories? I feel safe in my bed because it is my bed. Even when I cannot sleep, I feel a touch of, no other way to put it, certainty. That this is an illusion goes without saying, but then so is everything. It is why I have such trouble letting go. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, David.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's dive into some conversation here. Gosh, collective narrative. You mentioned that word at the top of the hour, and it seems to me, obviously, we're living in a time with a total collapse of, or a collapse of the collective narrative. And can you talk a little bit about where we find ourselves, maybe first as writers, and then we'll talk more about broadly about where we are as a nation. But I'd love to hear your talk about how we show up as writers in a time of narrative collapse, and maybe unpack that term for us a bit.
Let me get some water. I would be happy to. I mean, I think about this a lot, and I think about this a lot, both aesthetically and politically. Fiction writer, as an essayist, well, I shouldn't, let me just start. Constitutionally, I'm a relativist. So I believe that, I believe in truth, whatever that is, but I just don't believe that my mind or anyone else's mind is capacious enough to be able to perceive it. And I think that, that as a kind of aesthetic act of faith, that's a really important place to sit, especially I think for an essayist, because I am writing through my own lens. I'm writing about, I may be writing about collective experience. I may be I write about private experience, but also public experience, but even a private experience shared with someone else, their version of that experience and mine are completely different. And both of them have validity. So I think there is a kind of relativity to sort of truth or reality, or how we comprehend who we are or where we are, or any of those kind of things. But I think that now, particularly the last 4 years, probably before that, but it's really, for obvious reasons, been heightened in the last 4 years, we've crossed into a political realm where that same kind of relativity or sense of, I don't like the kind of use of your truth, my truth. I sort of stay away from that construction, but that sense of kind of multiple overlapping or even conflicting truths that are equally valid in some way has become a vast political problem. I mean, look at where we are right now. I mean, look at what the president is tweeting about, how the election is a fraud, when the election is absolutely not a fraud. I actually believe he believes that, but that, his belief in it doesn't make it a true fact. And so I think it's a really interesting and difficult position, right? I mean, I'm much more conflicted, let's say, on questions of the relativity of truth in the current political climate than I was, 10 years ago when I was thinking about it as a purely aesthetic concern.
I teach writing, I know as well you do. And one of the things I talk about is how, all narratives are false to some extent, right? And so when you talk about the collapse of a collective narrative, we're talking about the collapse of the story that holds us together, but there's also so much falseness in the collective narrative. Can you talk about that at all?
Well, I think I think one of the things about that any collective narrative, and if you're talking about a collective national narrative, like our American narrative, it's a narrative, it's a progressive narrative in the sense that, I mean, I hope it's a progressive narrative in the other sense too, but it's a progressive narrative in the sense that it builds on itself and it changes. And so it's a dynamic narrative. Maybe that's a better word for it, where we're constantly kind of collectively revising and rewriting the narrative, and adjusting the narrative, editing the narrative. I think, because I think that narratives are subjective, I don't think about them as fixed. I think about them as adjustable. And so, in terms of that public narrative, I think, yes, I mean, and we can look at, as an example, I don't mean to harp on this, but since it's just what's going on now, the notion of elections, which is a story that we have collectively told ourselves over 200 plus years of the country, and have expanded and changed, right, in terms of, increasing suffrage for various people as the dynamic narrative continues to move forward, is something that we should just take for granted, right? That is a story that it's a consensual hallucination that we all agree to participate in. But now we have this question. I mean, rational people do not have a question, but there is this kind of this disruption of that narrative, or of the faith in that narrative. And I think that is a real, there should be some things that we can come together and agree on as actual. And I fear our loss of that.
I can't. Last weekend I watched the Netflix documentary about John Lennon. Have you seen that one?
Yeah.
I can't help but make the connection with your essay, and like you mentioned him in the essay as well, but being in bed and the way in which a figure like John Lennon did hold the narrative together for a while. The Beatles did, for example, in some way. And I guess I'm just wanting to So, hey, what was your opinion of the documentary, first of all, and did it say anything to you important about where we are now?
I like the documentary. I mean, I didn't, I knew most of what was in it, but I'm always happy to revisit him. I mean, I'm always happy to just see his face. So, or hear, or see him move on a screen, or hear him, hear his voice. So, so it was, for me, it was a kind of like reassuringly nostalgic in a certain way. Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously part of it is that we live in a completely fragmented culture at this point, in a way that we didn't exactly before, even in terms of kind of common reference points and common benchmarks, because there is we have so much access to so much information and so much art, so much literature, so much music, so much so much film, so many images, that we now, I think, can't take for granted that we all have a kind of similar pool, a similar baseline of cultural information to draw on, like that shared kind of common territory. On the one hand, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world, because I think that, as we're talking about, it does open up the conversation to all sorts of voices that weren't getting into the conversation back when we had a kind of shared, kind of constant collective narrative. But on the other hand, without at least some commonality, it doesn't give us enough of a big enough Venn diagram of kind of shared, as I say, shared reference points, shared experience, shared history even. And I don't know what to do about that. I mean, I think that is, it's too early to tell. I don't know what to do about that, but I'm aware of that. As I think there are all sorts of reasons for the kind of breakdown of collective narrative.
What do you have to read next?
I thought I would jump to a couple of short poems. And so I'll start with this one, because I made a reference in that essay to my son and his troubles with his eating disorder. And so, for a period of time, that was a big central issue in our family life. And so this is a poem that kind of deals with that I wrote probably, I don't know, let me just think for a minute. Probably about a year and a half before I wrote that essay. And it's called Simone Weil. I've always been kind of fascinated with Simone Weil. As you can see, bad Simone Weil. I'm a lover of these utilitarian titles. I like a utilitarian title. And then I'll read a second poem after that, which also has a utilitarian title, which we'll get to in a minute. All right, so this poem is called Simone Weil. I keep thinking of Simone Weil, about whom I know just enough to worry that my son will follow her extreme example, not towards activism, but starvation. She died in 1943, aged 34, wasted by disease and hunger, refusing to eat, in solidarity with the French living under German occupation. My son is not like that. He has never cared particularly for the big issues, although he is a loyal friend, the one others can count on to make sure they get home. So why can't he care for himself? Adrift in a life where every meal is a potential act of treachery, where the only occupying army is that which camps out in his soul. Soul. Weil was concerned with the soul also. It may have been what killed her, this mystic's faith in reconciliation, brought up short by a world in which communion seems a futile gesture, and prayer is just another form of wishful thinking, a child's what-if game. Weil was no child, but she died uncompromising, unregenerate, or is it more accurate to say that she died of love? Either way, I can't help thinking about her parents, whom she led to America to escape the Nazis, and how they felt after she had martyred herself on a cross of her own making, how they felt after she was gone. What good is love, after all, if it can't sustain us? I ask myself this question all the time now, a prayer, a silent whisper, wishful thinking, aware that there is no one listening, and yet unable somehow to make myself stop. And then I'm going to read one more poem. I just need to find it here, which is a different kind of a poem. I'm as a writer, I go back and forth. I like games. I like kind of structures, like the poem I just read. I kind of made up a structure there because I wanted a long, thin poem to kind of reflect the, sort of visually to reflect the content of the poem. So I created a structure where each they're not really stanzas with breaks, but they're broken into sentences. Each sentence is done in lines of 2 words, and then the last line of the sentence is a single word. And then I partly because I like to. There's another piece I'll read later, which is also that kind of structural game. But I also, I like to kind of set those challenges for myself as a writer. Can I write within these restraints? How can I be creative within these kind of restraints? But I also really like kind of loose diaristic poetry, and so I've written a bunch of that. So this poem I'm about to read is a diaristic poem. Also domestic, you can tell, I read a lot about family and home life. This one, similarly utilitarian in title, is called Porch. Early mid-July, late on a Sunday, avenue so empty, I can imagine almost I am somewhere else. Then a burst of fireworks and a jet descending into LAX. I am on the porch riding out this heat wave, not waiting for my daughter, although I know that's what she's thinking when she returns home early from dinner with friends. It is the last summer before she goes to college, and since graduation, I have watched as she has molted, shedding us as if we were old skin. These milestones, they mark us just as the years do. They are what render us distinct. This summer, I will pay attention, not allow these moments to slip away from me, refuse to let them slide. And yet, who knows really what will happen? Here I am, perhaps a beer or 2 beyond my limit, sitting in the quiet, porch lit low. My son, he installed these lights, not last year, but the one before that, after he moved back in the first time. Now he is living here again for summer only, or at least that's what we've agreed. He is at work now, will be home by 2 or 3, or whenever the club closes. Although the last few nights I haven't heard him, which makes me wonder what attention means. Is it vigilance or relaxation? Is it a holding on or a letting go? Instead of deciding, I remain outside, feet propped on the wrought iron of the garden rail, while in the distance the city emits its low and ambient buzzing like a rumble in the chest of the earth. To the south, another run of fireworks, although the holiday has passed us. A car creeps up the avenue, but no one can see me. A siren echoes in some other corner of the night. But after, silence. Stillness. Although the city, it is not quite sleeping. It is inhaling, catching its breath as a breeze stirs, first one in days, through all this searing swelter. And above my head, the leaves of sycamore rustle, reminder that in the morning, or even now, the world will wake, will start to move again. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's talk about books and publishing. This past week, I read your book, The Lost Art of Reading, and as you described the Great Gatsby in your own recollection of the cover of that book, and I had the same recollection of that cheap paperback cover that we got in college back in our time, and just the way that held some things together in a way, I guess. And can you talk about books and publishing, since you were the book critic and the editor of the LA Times Book Review? Where are we now in the evolution of the book?
I think we're where we always were, which is that, the book is the physical book, the print book, let's say, is a pretty perfect it's pretty perfect technology. And so I think that, for me, one of the great things about the last, let's say, 10, 12 years. Well, there's a number of things that I think are really interesting, great. I think we're in really good shape in terms of the writing community, in terms of what kind of writing is out there, in terms of books. I mean, there's definitely sort of big issues in terms of conglomeration of big time corporate publishing. I mean, that the sort of the Random House Simon & Schuster merger and all of that. But just at the level of kind of the work that's coming out, I think we're in a real golden age of American literature and probably global literature at this point. I think I'm as excited as a reader now, as maybe more excited to be reading now than I ever have been in my life, because I'm just discovering so many interesting voices, so many new kinds of storytelling, so much sort of innovation and experimentation, and also, a lot of blurring of genres, a lot of writers kind of creating their own territory. That's something that I feel quite sympathetic to, both as a reader and, as an editor or a teacher, but also as a writer. And so I think that there's, a lot of the kind of, let's say the kind of divisions or the sort of pillars of how we thought about genre and form have kind of become a little bit more porous, and I think that that's really exciting. I think that in terms of access and availability of books, again, I think the physical book isn't going anywhere. We've seen that over the last 10 years, just in terms of numbers. But I also think that the availability of books in a variety of forms, digital forms, I'm old, so I still tend to read, I like to read paper. I like to read ink on paper, but I have, hundreds of books on my phone. And, like the idea that I can be, back in the before time and hopefully in the after time, out in the world and be like, waiting for something and bored and have, be able to pull out, an actual library on my phone and pick something to read is really, really exciting. And also, when I was at the LA Times, a colleague of mine, Hector Tobar, who's also is a phenomenal novelist and journalist, but he reported a piece on what cell phones were doing in underdeveloped countries where there weren't libraries and bookstores, in terms of making literature accessible and available to a wider swath of the population. If your town didn't have a library or bookstore and the nearest library or bookstore was 100 miles away, you weren't getting books. But the ability to download books or read books on the internet really opened up that territory. And so I think just in terms of access and immediacy, also the fact that I still do a fair amount of criticism, and as a writer in that territory, that I can basically find lots of texts online, if I'm looking for a quote, right, or if I'm looking to reread an essay or something. It's the instant access of it, I think, for a kind of committed and engaged reader, it's sort of a dream time in some way.
Are you doing anything to preserve your attention span in this age of devices?
I think when I wrote Lost Art of Reading originally, because I wrote that book in 2010, and then I updated it in 18 for the second edition. But when I wrote that book originally, I was having a lot of trouble. That was one of the impetuses. I don't want to say it was the impetus to write the book, but it was one of the impetuses to explore that question, was that I was finding myself beset by distraction, right? It was impossible for me to, I couldn't sit down and read. I couldn't sit down and read 20 pages. Now, partly that was because at the time I was editing the book section at the LA Times. So my inbox was just a constant thing. Like I was on email all day, all the time. That abated when I stopped doing that job and became book critic, and I was just kind of focusing on my own stuff. But there was also a kind of conscious gesture, which was to sort of, walk away from the phone, put the phone in a different room. I found myself, particularly during quarantine, adhering to a lot of those rules, in the sense that I shut down, because I always worked a lot at home as a writer. But now that I'm working entirely at home, I find it really important to have at least a temporal demarcation of when the workday ends. So for the last several months, I've been basically closing the computer at like 5:30, 6 o'clock, 6:30, whenever I finish, and then not going back on. Or maybe if I'll go and listen to some music or something, but really like assiduously avoiding even looking to see what's on email or social media, because I don't want to get drawn into it. And that has been really effective for me in terms of creating, carving out, let's say, a workspace and a reading space, a workspace and a reading space. I read at night. I'm not on the computer in a way that feels really productive.
One more question about publishing. What are your thoughts on self-publishing? Obviously, there's a lot of, people doing that, but is there anything coming out of that of importance? And is there, anything that you pay attention to from the self-publishing world?
I would break it into two ways. I definitely pay attention to, how would I put it? I definitely pay attention to publishing projects, let's say literary journals, like collectives, things like that. I'm less interested generally in a writer publishing their own work. Maybe I should say I tend to be a little, skeptical in some ways about that. Not to say that there aren't great books that have been self-published and put out into the world, but I'm definitely, I encourage my students, for instance, when they ask me about, how do we get published, I always tell them, start something. You guys should start something. Start a journal, put together an anthology. I think for me, one of the great things about publishing in general, however you do it, is the collaborative nature of it. I love being edited. I love having an art designer. I'm working on a project now, contributing an essay to a book where there will be maps. And I was just today put in touch with the map maker, the cartographer who's going to create the map to illustrate my piece. I love that. Like, I'm really curious to see how this person interprets the essay and to see how, what kind of conversations we have about it. For me, the kind of one writer sort of self-publishing their own work is a little bit different from that. My skepticism also has to do with the fact that when I was editing the book section at the Times, we would get tons of self-published books and we could never do anything with them because we didn't have enough staff to vet them. So in terms of trying to read enough of a book to figure out whether it was whether it was something we should take a look at, we just simply didn't have that kind of personnel. But so I think it's a mixed bag, but I definitely am all in favor of sort of, collectives of writers, collectives of artists kind of collaborating on projects as a way of showcasing their own work.
Where's your mind going next in terms of your own writing?
There's always a bunch of stuff. So I am, as I said, I've been playing with that collection of essays for a while now, trying to figure out how to make it work as a book. It doesn't really work it's too diaristic and too sort of unshaped as a draft to just sort of say, okay, here's all the raw material and that's the book. So I've been thinking about that. That's one of my goals for 2021 is to finish that book. I have two other books. I don't really talk about work in progress, but I have two other books. One is a work of fiction, one is a work of nonfiction that are at various stages in progress. Both are far enough along now where I've decided to finish one and then go back to the other. So those are the three projects that I'm currently kind of juggling, I guess.
I want to have you read one more time for us. I have one more question. Can you talk? We have a lot of writers that do follow us on the show, and can you talk a little bit about process and how you think about your work day, your work life, and teaching duties, family duties? How do you think about separating these things and being productive and creative?
That's an excellent question. I mean, it's changed for me over the years. When I was younger, I used to be a night writer, and I would literally sometime there was a period of time when I was in my 20s and early 30s before I had kids that I would literally start my writing day at 10 p.m. and write till 4 a.m. and it was great. I miss that. Although there's no possible way that I could do that now. When I had kids, I started to become more of a kind of pragmatic writer in the sense that when they were little, I would, when they were asleep, I would write. And, when they were out, or if we didn't have a lot of money, but we had a babysitter one afternoon a week. When the babysitter was there, those 5 hours, I would just be holed up in the corner writing. And so that was really, that was a matter of necessity, but it was also turned out to be really useful because it made me flexible as a writer in the sense that I do write most days. I don't write every day, but I do write most days. And I generally am a morning writer because my mind is fresher, the day is quieter, stuff hasn't started to happen. That became a habit that really got codified when I was at the LA Times because I would get up at for instance, when I was writing Lost Art of Reading and I was still editing the book section, I would get up at 6:30 and write for a few hours before I went into the office. And I really like writing in the early morning. Almost as much as I liked writing in the late night. So, generally speaking, I'll kind of write in the morning and then do other things in the afternoon, read, edit. Most all my classes are in the afternoon. Partly, I think that's just the schedule, but also it kind of suits me. I never liked morning classes as a student, and I don't particularly like them as a teacher either. So I'm happy to have that afternoon schedule. But it varies. And certainly before lockdown, there were days where I was at home working, and then my teaching days I would go to campus and be there. I have an office there, and so I would be there. And there was something also really useful for me about the kind of physical movement of those places. That's something that I didn't realize I missed, or I didn't realize how kind of emotionally sustaining it was for me until I've been operating from. Basically I sit at this desk where I'm sitting now for 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, staring into this computer for the last 9 months. So I miss the campus part of it. But I think for me, it's really good to have variety, both because I get bored easily And also because I like all of these, like as I said, I like editing. I love editing. I wasn't expecting to love editing when I kind of fell into editing, but I love it. I mean, writing, it's too complicated to call that relationship love. It's a complicated love with writing, but it's the first love. And, and as it turns out, for someone who is a fairly reluctant student, I love teaching because I like working with young writers. I like hearing what they have to say. They know all kinds of things that I know nothing about. I learn a ton from them. And I like being in a room where we can talk about art unironically, right? Where we can actually talk about what's on the table, what we're reading and what we're creating as art. And that's the aspiration. We don't have to put air quotes around it. We don't have to like pretend that we're too cool for art or any of that kind of stuff. I love being in a room where we can talk seriously about art,
I have to ask one more question. What are young writers? A lot of us are over 50 here, probably. What are young writers thinking about that we all need to know, that you might be in touch with?
The young writers I'm dealing with are thinking, they're thinking about the same kinds of things that we are in some way or were at their age. They're thinking about like what's their place in the world. They're thinking about like what's going to be left for them. I mean, they're in a, it's a more toxic world obviously than it was when I was, when I was their age. I mean, when I was their age, Reagan was president, so it wasn't like it was a utopia. Although compared to where we are now, it actually doesn't seem as bad as it was when we were living through it. So, there's something really interesting about that sliding scale, but they're worried about that stuff. As writers, aesthetically, they're really, at least my students are, and this may be just a kind of, a kind of limited sample because they're coming to work with me and I'm interested in this, but they're really interested in like, in kind of fragmentation, strategies of fragmentation, building narratives out of pieces rather than necessarily, I mean, they also will write a straight through coherent narrative, but they're really interested in kind of fragmentation as an approach. They're really interested in sort of dislocation in some way as a kind of texture, or exploring the question of dislocation, kind of using creating prose that embodies the kind of dislocation they feel in a society that feels to them like it's kind of coming apart at the seams. They're not particularly interested in our or at least in the ones that I learned, they're not particularly interested in our hierarchies of let's call it of like high culture and mass culture. They don't care about that at all, which I think is all to the good. And they don't suffer fools. I had one student, I can't remember, it's like about a year ago, who at the end, in the last class, we were talking and I said something about, well, what else, what other observations? And this student said to me, what I've learned? And I said, what? And she said that wisdom doesn't necessarily come with age. And I was like, I don't know if you're saying that about me or not, but you're absolutely correct. Wisdom does not necessarily come with age. So they're smart, they're cynical, they're edgy. I think they're great.
Cool. Well, what do you have left for us to read tonight?
I'm going to read a really short essay that also kind of comes out of the game territory, or is a kind of gamey sort of thing. It's called Three Angels. It was published about a year and a half ago in Brevity. And so just a couple things with this. Brevity, for those of you who don't know Brevity, it's a kind of flash nonfiction digital literary journal. It's been around for a long time. In fact, they're a collection of sort of best essays from the site, was just reviewed in this morning's New York Times book review. And it's edited by Dinty Moore. Their criteria, how they define flash nonfiction, is 750 words or less. And so I decided that again, this is an essay in 3 parts. There are 3 numbered parts. They're structured the same. So there are 3 longish paragraphs per part and 1 single line paragraph per part. They echo, and just also to add another little game element to the dynamic, each of the 3 parts is 250 words. So when I was putting this thing together, it took me 7 months to put together this 750 word essay, because it was like a little Oli Poe type experiment. As I say, I don't always write this way. It's weird that I'm reading a couple of pieces that developed this way tonight, but I kind of like it. I like kind of as I said, I like kind of creating a condition or set of conditions or rules that I have to play with as a creative challenge. So this was a piece that grew out of that. I should also say that this piece was begun at a time when I was I don't really believe in writer's block, but I do think there's ebb and flow. And this piece was begun at a time when I was really it was an ebb period as a writer. I wasn't doing a lot of writing. And so there was a way that kind of creating that game challenge for me and making it sort of fun I was sort of trying to trick myself into coming back. So let me find it here and I will read it. It's called Three Angels. 1. The first angel arrives dressed in yellow. I can't stop looking at her face. She rises from the sidewalk at the crest of Sacramento and Buchanan, grinning, mouth cracked open, upturned to the sky. She's around my age, it looks like, which means she is more old than young. Not old enough, however, never old enough. I watch as I climb Sacramento. She doesn't notice me. Her shape emerges as if by unfolding. Head, hair translucent, skin pale but streaked with color, couple of loose lines, then shoulders, yellow gown and wrap, bare legs encased in yellow socks. She is using an aluminum walker for balance as she spins a slow pirouette. That's when I catch sight of the hospital, which stretches back from the corner like a monolith. She is near the sliding front doors. And I don't want to be rude or intrusive, but I recognize what I see. Human being in sick garments before the pest house, on permanent or temporary reprieve. Reflexively, I conjure a story, surgical survivor, at risk of death, but also fully present in this spot at this moment, alive and porous, taking in everything. Those eyes wide, they are holy. I don't know how else to say it. Beatific, like a saint. A saint, yes, or an angel, although we are not in the city of angels, city of St. Francis instead. Francis was 44 when he died 792 years ago, pierced by stigmata. He is the patron saint of not dying alone. 2. The second angel arrives dressed in pressed slacks and a long sleeve shirt, flat shoes on her feet. She appears fully formed in the elevator of the medical building where my wife has just been told she needs a second surgery on her knee. We are on the 3rd floor and my wife is barely on this side of weeping. Come on, I coax in an attempt to be consoling. That scar, it's a badge of honor. It means you're a warrior. The elevator door slides open as we're talking. The angel stands within. We step inside and continue our conversation. My wife saying she is tired, that she can't bear another setback, that she has had enough. Since March, she mourns. I've been in pain since March. She shrinks into a corner of the car. I look at her, face shuttered, downturned. This is when the angel starts to speak. I've got a scar too, she announces, from a cesarean. I got it giving birth to my son. Briefly, I wonder if she's going to lift her shirt to show us, but the moment passes. Instead, she is merely pausing for a breath. That scar, she goes on, you earned it. My wife flashes a wan smile, offers thanks. Every day, the angel whispers, each time I get dressed, my scar reminds me of what I have been through. It reminds me of who I am. Stigmata, I imagine, as the elevator ticks down past the 2nd floor. 3. The 3rd angel arrives dressed in maroon skirt and gray t-shirt, white hair in a thick ponytail. She too looks around my age. I am trying not to stare as she lurches across the outdoor plaza of the museum court behind a different sort of walker, one that unfolds into a chair. Her movements are blunt, blocky, expression etched into a grimace that may be more the face of effort than despair. I am visiting the museum with my parents who are aging. I wonder if their reason has begun to slip. A minute ago, my father suggested we take a table where a young man is waiting. He did not understand when I said that we could not. The angel, meanwhile, is sitting now with her companion, eating ice cream on a stick beneath the summer sun. Her eyes are raw as if from trauma, runny egg whites striped with blood. And I can see myself, my wife, in her features. She looks like someone we might know. That skirt, my wife has one not unlike it. When she wears it, her surgical scar emerges from beneath the hem. Again, I tell myself a story about what's happened, although this time the subject is less redemption than its antonym. Surgery, side effects, the deterioration we all pretend will not belong to us. Suddenly the woman leans forward, gaze electric. When she stands, her skirt is streaked, urine, stigmata, angel in her temporary body. She is the patron saint of everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a writer, this is more of a journalism question, or is there a writer, columnist that you look forward to reading, who writes with some frequency, who you kind of pick up the iPad first thing in the morning, or you wait for their weekly column or their monthly column? Who do you wait to read? Who do you look forward to reading?
It depends. They're a bunch. I think one who I just read an essay in the current issue of Harper's by is Hari Kunzru, who is mostly a novelist, but I think is also a really brilliant kind of essayist and critic and political thinker, political writer. His essay in Harper's has to do, he sort of uses the QAnon phenomenon to jump off into an essay about complexity and simplicity and conspiracy theory and things like that, all of which are subjects that interest me. And I'm really curious about the play of his mind. Another one, just as a critic, is Joan Acocella in the New Yorker, who also I just had a piece in their most recent issue where she, she just bursts out. She'll write a review. She was writing a review of a newly translated collection of short stories by an Italian children's book writer who died in 1980, whose stuff has never been available in the US. And she talks about one of his books that's out of print. And she mentions, I just went on Amazon looking for it, and it's like $795 to get a copy of this. And then she writes, "This is a crime against art." And then she continues into the essay. So there's this way that at least I am so aware of her presence in those essays and in that criticism, and so aware of the kind of the writer behind the words. And then she'll kind of pop out periodically, at the end of that review, for instance, when she's talking about how good the book is, she then jumps out and directly addresses us as readers again and says, "Go buy it right now." And I love that kind of direct engagement. So those are two that are just in my head, because literally last night I read essays by each of them, and I was delighted to see them. Those are writers I'll read, even if they're writing about things that I know nothing about or have absolutely or would say I had no interest in.
Right. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's really been a joy, and man, it's fun to try to keep up with you. It's futile, but it's a joy. So thank you so much. And would you happen to be around for a few more minutes to open?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me. This was really, this is great. I love having the opportunity to read some work, but also talk about it. It's a great format, and I really appreciate the invitation. So thanks for having me, and thank you all for coming.
Well, go ahead and open the room up, Juniper.
Yes, everybody has the ability to unmute themselves now and ask questions or say hello.
Hello, Juniper.
Hello, you still here, Stan?
Oh yeah.
Hey.
I just have my little piece of tape that I draw an eyeball on. Camera on any device. I know they're watching and listening, but I'd rather not open myself up.
Phil, how are you doing tonight, Phil?
I'm fine. I'm wondering what kind of high culture essayists do you think are going to persist from, say, the 18th or 19th century?
Excellent.
I know you're interested in the distinctions, but do you believe in classics, or do you believe in work that gets tried over time and persists?
By all means, yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of things persist. I think, for me, often working with undergrads, I want to work backwards. So I kind of start them with what's happening now, and then I kind of move back. So we'll start, let's say with, I don't know, let's say we start with Claudia Rankine or Sarah Manguso, or let's start with those two, and then maybe we move back and we read Didion and Baldwin, and then maybe we move back, we move further back. I want to give, I feel like, I want to give them the grounding in the form, and then kind of open up their minds to the long history of the form. But absolutely, in that as an example. But absolutely, I think that I'm always reading work from other times and other centuries, and I think it's essential. One book I've assigned with mixed results, although I will continue to assign it to undergrads, is the Confessions, or essay writers and memoir writers, is the Confessions of St. Augustine, because it's the beginning of the first person self-conscious I in Western narrative. And also it's kind of, it's a classic story about a reprobate who found God. It's every recovery memoir. It's the genesis point for every memoir of recovery or addiction or anything like that. And I think it's a fascinating, they stumble over the theology, and I always say to them, hey, I stumble over the theology too. But let's read the human story. Let's read the story of his conversion with Santa Monica, with his mother, And and so I think there are things, I have them, but depending on the class, I'll assign all kinds of things. I had students reading from the Decameron this spring because I was having them, we were working on pandemic essays because I wanted them to have the opportunity to write about what they were going through, and I wanted them to feel that their experience was writable. But I also wanted them to kind of think about the tradition. So, we went and I pulled some things as I said, from that. We read a little bit of Defoe, Journal of the Plague Year. I had them look at Camus and some other things just to sort of get a sense of that tradition. And, not that they had to write in it, but that that this was a kind of ongoing human situation. It was new to us, but it was something that, succeeding generations across time have dealt with this kind of, have been at the mercy of pandemic and plague. So I want to contextualize it for them, but by all means, I think that work is some of the most important, it can be some of the most important work to me.
Does David Foster Wallace persist, do you think?
I mean, he's tricky for them. I think some of the I don't know how to put it. Some of the kind of bloom is off the rose for him in terms of young readers. But I think he'll be back. I think there's a way that his work is electric and is exciting, and again, kind of pushes them in directions that they wouldn't necessarily expect to go. I've taught the cruise ship piece, and I teach more the nonfiction of his nonfiction than his fiction. I've taught the cruise ship piece. I've taught the state fair piece. I've taught a few other things, but really, for me, it's like, yeah, you can write an amazing sort of piece of nonfiction narrative about the most cliched experience, right? You go on a cruise ship for a week, where's the interest in that? Well, he found it. I also want to kind of, as a teaching tool, I want to expose students to things that they would have a preconception would be uninteresting, and then have them be turned around because the key in nonfiction, or at least for me as an essayist, is it's always the point of view, it's the voice, it's the teller more than what's being told, right? And Wallace is such a dynamic teller.
I sometimes wonder if he'll come back as nostalgia, and how horrified he'd be as that, as a relic of the 90s. Or
yeah, he's too good for that, I think. But.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question,
Yeah,
please?
please? Yes.
I just have, I was thinking of this. I was an elementary school teacher. And I just wanted to know if your students prefer to write on the paper or to compose on the computer, or they just make that personal choice.
I think some of them are making that some of them, they're mostly working on computer, or a lot of them are using their phones the way that I and, writers of my generation use notebooks. Like I still have, I always have this little pocket notebook, fits in the back pocket of my pants. And I'm always taking notes have hundreds of them going back years. But what I've found from, talking to some of my undergrads is they're using the notes function on their phone in a similar kind of way that I use the notebook. And then they're mostly composing on a computer because that's the medium they're mostly, especially now with distance learning and all that the computer is the medium through which they're generally interacting anyway. But I'm really interested in that kind of use of the notes function on the phone. In fact, there was a writer earlier this year, a writer in New York, a guy named Kevin Wynn, who published his first novel in March, had written a large part of that novel on the notes function on the phone. He had a day job and he lived in the city, take the subway, to work, and he'd sit on the subway and work on the novel on the notes function on his phone on his way to work and on his way back. And that was how the first raw draft of that novel got composed. So again, as I was saying with sort of, electronic reading, any way that these devices allow us to be more creatively flexible and fluid, I'm fascinated by that, totally interested in it, and all in favor of it.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Thank you, David. I really appreciate your time, and it's been a pleasure. So thank you, everybody, for coming here, and we'll be back next week with Writing for Peace Sunday Live lit reading, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm glad you made it, Stan.
Peace.
Yes.
See you someday on the other side.
Yes. Yep. I'll come up and see you before it's over. Yes.
Thank you all. David, you're a wonderful writer. Always
great.
known that. Okay.
Great to see you.
Same
Take
here.
good care, everybody.
Bye.